European history, the Congress system or the Concert of Europe, 1880–1830. The Congress system or the Concert of Europe, 1880–1830. The Congress system was a series of periodic meetings or congresses of the European powers intended to solve European problems diplomatically, and it stretched between 1818 and 1830. The Congress system was born out of a treaty or alliance between four countries, i.e. Britain, Russia, Austria and Prussia. This treaty or alliance was known as the Quadruple Alliance of 1815. The treaty was signed on 20th November 1815, and it was signed on the same day with the Second Treaty of Paris, which punished France following the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo of 1815. Among other things, the Quadruple Alliance stated that the four kings, united for the good of the world, have agreed to continue meeting because those countries were to take a collective effort in handling European matters. Then the Congress system came to be known as the Concert of Europe. Objectives of the Congress system: to ensure that the signatories, those powers that had signed the alliance, continued to cooperate, and therefore the aim was to promote international cooperation. The four countries, i.e. Austria, Russia, Britain and Prussia, agreed to exclude the Bonaparte dynasty or family from the political affairs of France in Europe, to ensure that the terms of the Second Treaty of Paris of November 1815 were implemented, to maintain peace in Europe. The aim here was to avoid other wars similar to the Napoleonic Wars, which would disturb European peace, to protect and maintain the power of the legitimate rulers in Europe, to maintain all the decisions that had been agreed upon in the Vienna Settlement that was signed in June 1815. The composition of the Congress system. The Congress system was composed of the following congresses named after the places where they were held: the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle of 1818, the Congress of Troppau of 1820, the Congress of Labour of 1821, the Congress of Rouen of 1822. European history, the Congress system or the Concert of Europe, 1818–1830. Treaty of Paris of November 1815. It was therefore no longer necessary to keep France a permanent enemy, and for that matter the army occupation was removed from France, and to maintain peace with France, the members of the Quadruple Alliance admitted France into their alliance, and now it was an alliance of 5 countries. Therefore, the name was changed to the Quintuple Alliance. Also, it was noted at this Congress that the Jews had been persecuted for a long time and denied citizenship wherever they settled. It was therefore agreed in the Aix-la-Chapelle that the Jews had to be given freedom and the right to settle peacefully in all areas where they had been living before, and not to be persecuted anymore. At this Congress, the members also approved the measures for the security of Napoleon Bonaparte on the island of St. Helena, because they did not want Napoleon's influence in Europe again, as they had an experience when Napoleon escaped from the island of Elba and ruled France again for some time. This was achieved until the death of Napoleon in 1821. At this Congress, Prussia and Russia suggested that an international army be established, that this army was to be used to protect the existing rulers legitimate from being overthrown by revolutions, and also for the purpose of maintaining peace. This suggestion was made by the King of Prussia, known as Frederick William Roman III, and Tsar Alexander I of Russia. At the same Congress, the issue of the Barbary pirates was brought. These pirates or robbers were operating on the Mediterranean Sea. They used to capture ships and steal their weapons, and therefore Russia suggested that an international army was necessary to fight against these pirates. There was also the issue of slave trade at the same Congress. Countries suggested that it was necessary to cooperate and stop the practice of slave trade. Russia, Prussia and France, for example, suggested that the international army was to be used to look for those ships that were carrying slaves across the continents and give punishments to the slave traders. Reactions. Prince Metternich of Austria rejected the formation of an international army. He reasoned that the creation of this army would bring about the spread of Russian influence in Europe. He feared that Russian soldiers would get the advantage of being stationed across the continent of Europe, and Russia would become the most powerful state and therefore would upset or change the balance of power in Europe. The British representative Lord Castlereagh also opposed the idea of Tsar Alexander I to create an international army for the purpose of maintaining the legitimate rulers in power. The British representative feared that the Congress system was to be used to intervene in the domestic affairs of other European countries for the purpose of protecting the existing rulers even when those rulers were unpopular. Therefore, Russia and Prussia withdrew their proposal on creating an international army. On the issue of slave trade, Britain proposed that other European powers give her permission to stop slave trade. The British representative Lord Castlereagh suggested that Britain was to hunt and search for ships that were carrying slaves in the waters of West Africa. He stated that Britain was to set the slaves free but arrest the crew and charge them in the British courts of law that had been established on the West African coast, especially in Sierra Leone. European history, the Congress system or the Concert of Europe, 1818–1813. Capture and search their ships and the ships that had flags of their nations. They would have abused their sovereignty or independence. They also rejected British interference in their trade with countries of West Africa where Britain already had an upper hand. They even wondered as to why Britain, which had originally benefited from slave trade, was denying them to benefit from the same. The British government and public became annoyed because the other powers had refused to support their proposals, and therefore the gap between Britain and other powers started to widen, and it became very difficult for the Congress system to achieve its objective of international cooperation. It should however be noted that the Congress ended in disagreement over the issue of the creation of an international army. The Congress of Troppau, 1820. The Congress was called by Tsar Alexander of Russia. He was scared of a liberal revolution that broke out in Spain, which was south of France, against King Ferdinand Roman VII. This Ferdinand Roman VII had been restored by the Vienna Congress. Tsar Alexander I was also scared by the outbreak of other revolutions in Portugal, Naples and Piedmont. Naples and Piedmont were states in Italy which was not yet a united kingdom. Tsar Alexander I wanted the Allied powers to meet and deal with the revolutions because they threatened the survival of the existing legitimate rulers. In January 1820, a revolution broke out in Spain. The revolution was led by the Spanish soldiers who lived in very poor conditions at the Spanish ports as they waited to be shipped to South America, where Spain and Portugal had colonies, and these colonies wanted independence. The revolution started in Madrid and spread to other towns like Barcelona. King Ferdinand Roman VII of Spain feared that the revolutionaries were removing him from power, and in a desperate move to save his seat, he gave the Spanish the liberal constitution of 1812 they had got from Napoleon I of France when he invaded Spain. When this happened, Tsar Alexander I, who was very conservative, belief in no change, feared that such a move was to encourage liberals in other countries of Europe to demand for similar constitutions, including those of Russia. Therefore, he wanted the members of the Congress system to crush the revolution in Spain and withdrew the constitution. Reaction. Lord Castlereagh reacted by presenting a paper on 5 May 1820, and this became the future British foreign policy. In this paper, he stated that Britain wasn't to intervene in the domestic affairs of any European state, and that Britain wasn't to ignore a situation when other powers intervened. The British representative insisted that the Spanish Revolution was a Spanish affair, and he rejected the suggestion of Alexander I to send soldiers Allied forces to Spain. As a result, the gap between Britain and other powers widened further, such that it was difficult to promote the objective of international cooperation. Lord Castlereagh refused to attend the Congress of Troppau but sent an observer. Even France also sent an observer. However, Alexander I persuaded the representatives of Austria and Prussia to accept his view of intervening in the internal affairs of other countries and keep in power those rulers who were threatened by revolutions. European history, the Congress system, or the Concert of Europe, 1818-1813, also stated that the signatories were to enter into those countries that faced revolutions, suppress the revolutions, and restore the legitimate rulers. The protocol was rejected by Britain and France because they did not want their soldiers to die in foreign countries while maintaining unpopular regimes, and the Congress ended in disagreement. The Congress of Labour, 1821. The Congress was held in Austria and was called by Prince Metternich in the city of Labour. The Congress was called to discuss the liberal revolution in Naples, and at this Congress, Britain and France refused to send representatives, and therefore it was attended by the conservative countries of Russia, Austria and Prussia, who had accepted the Protocol of Troppau of 1820, which accepted intervening in the matters or domestic affairs of other states. The conservatives agreed to intervene in Naples and save King Ferdinand I from being overthrown in March 1821. Austria was the first to send her troops in Naples, which was in southern Italy, and while there, the revolutionaries were arrested, tortured, and others were killed, and those who survived went to live abroad. Britain strongly opposed this action, and this was another demonstration that Britain was not ready to promote international cooperation and also to maintain unpopular regimes that had been restored by the Vienna settlement. The Congress of Verona, October 1822. In March 1821, the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire staged a revolution against their rulers. The Greeks were Christians, and they revolted against their masters, the Turkish, who were Muslims. The Turkish rulers were mistreating them with imprisonment, overtaxation, arbitrary arrests, etc. When the revolution broke out, both Prince Metternich and Lord Castlereagh feared that Alexander I of Russia, who regarded himself as a guardian to the Greek Christians, would go to war with Turkey in support of the Greek Christians. If this happened, it would increase the influence of Russia in Eastern Europe in case Russia defeated Turkey, and this would upset or change the balance of power in Europe. This was something which those powers did not want to happen, and therefore the Congress of Verona had to discuss this issue. As the meeting started, the revolution in Spain against King Ferdinand Roman VII intensified. France, which shared the southern border with Spain, feared that the revolutionary virus in Spain would infect her citizens and overthrow the restored regime of Louis Roman VIII. In reaction, France changed her position from non-interference, and therefore her troops entered Spain in 1823 to crash the revolution and restore King Ferdinand Roman VII to full control. The consequence was that the Congress of Verona discussed more of the Spanish Revolt than the Greek Revolt. The change of representatives. As the Congress system continued in its operations, it was hit by misfortunes. In August 1820, Lord Castlereagh of Britain died and he was replaced by George Canning. The new British representative had very little experience in European affairs. Tsar Alexander I of Russia also died in 1825 and was replaced by Tsar Nicholas I. Like George Canning of Britain, Nicholas I had very little experience in European affairs. George Canning hated armed intervention in other countries and therefore he was not different from Lord Castlereagh whom he succeeded. He did not even attend the Congress of Verona but sent European History, the Congress System of the Concert of Europe, 1880-1830. Of the French troops to crash the revolution in Spain, and when the Allies rejected the protest, the Duke withdrew immediately before the Verona Congress ended its discussions. France invaded Spain in 1823 with a force of 200,000 soldiers. The French forces defeated the Liberals with less difficulty and abolished the Liberal Constitution. Thereafter, King Ferdinand Roman VII was restored to full control under Sonoy Britain the more. Unfortunately, the Allies were not able to send troops to South America to assist Spain keep the Spanish colonies which had revolted against the Spanish rule. In an attempt to revenge, George Canning encouraged the President of USA, James Monroe, to support the Spanish colonies in South America in their struggle for independence against Spain. Consequently, the President of USA came out with his document known as the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, in which he stated that the American continent was not a territory for future foreign colonialism and that the states of the continent should be left alone to run their own political systems. USA therefore would regard any colonial attempt on the American continent as a danger to its peace and security and a very unfriendly act. In the case of the Greek revolt, which was discussed at Verona, Britain got a promise from the Sultan of Turkey that he would reduce the mistreatment of the Greeks, and because of this promise, the danger of the Russian intervention was avoided. However, the Greek revolt continued until 1832 when Greece got her independence. The Greek War of Independence divided up the members of the Quintuple Alliance because Britain rejected its interference and supported the Greek Revolution of 1821 to 1832. The Congress of St. Petersburg, 1825. The Congress was held in Russia and it was attended by Russia and Austria. This Congress did not discuss any issue regarding European powers because the member states failed to reach an agreement. This was because of lack of full membership. Therefore, the Congress was aborted. The achievements of the Congress system. The Congress system maintained peace in Europe. The members of the system, for example Prince Metternich of Austria and Tsar Alexander I of Russia, were able to suppress revolts in 1820, 1821 and 1823 in Spain, Portugal, and Naples. There was no major war that involved all the great European powers until the outbreak of the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856, when Russia fought against Britain, France, and Turkey. It gave birth to European diplomacy. This was promoted through the holding of congresses to settle conflicts other than going for war. For example, a number of congresses were held between 1818 and 1825, which included the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle, of Les-Bas, Verona, and the aborted St. Petersburg. It led to the reconciliation of the victorious nations with the defeated nation, which was France. In 1818, for example, at the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle, France was allowed to join the Quadruple Alliance by the Great Powers. They did not want France to remain a permanent enemy, most especially that France had fulfilled the terms of the Second Treaty of Paris of 1815 and the army of occupation had to be removed from France. The Congress system led to the implementation of the terms of the Second Treaty of Paris of 1815. European history, the Congress system or the Concert of Europe, 1818-1830. Government in France was compelled to pay large amounts of money to the victorious nations by the Congress system, and consequently the army of occupation that had been stationed in France from 1815 was withdrawn. The Congress system maintained the political map of Europe as it had been decided to redrawn at the Vienna Congress of 1814 to 1815. For example, the boundaries of France were maintained as they had been reduced to those that France had in 1790. In addition, it maintained the buffer states which had been formed to guard against further French aggression. For example, the Kingdom of Netherlands in the north and the German Confederation in the east were maintained. The system maintained and protected the old rulers who had been restored by the Vienna Settlement of 1815. In Spain, for example, King Ferdinand Roman VII was saved from being overthrown by the revolutionaries by France and Austria because they did not support changes brought about by revolutions. In Naples, King Ferdinand I was also saved by Austria from being overthrown by the revolutionaries, and the decision to protect the restored rulers was taken at the Congress of Troppau of 1820. The Congress system kept the family of Napoleon I out of the politics of Europe. At the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle of 1818, for example, The congressmen agreed on the security measures that prevented Napoleon I from escaping all the way from the island of St. Helena to return to France the way he had escaped from the island of Elba and ruled France again for 100 years. It only became possible for a member of the Bonaparte dynasty to rule France in 1848 when the Congress system was no more. The system maintained a constitutional monarchy in France. Louis Roman 18 had been restored in France with the Constitution, and among other things the Constitution provided for a parliament and personal freedoms like freedom of worship, press and association. This was important because Louis Roman 18 could not impose his own rule on the Frenchmen the way Louis Roman 16 had done before he was overthrown by the revolutionaries. The system maintained the balance of power in Europe. At the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle of 1818, for example, Prussia had suggested the creation of an international army so as to fight against the sea pirates that were operating on the Mediterranean Sea. The proposal was rejected because Russia wanted to get the opportunity of stationing her soldiers in other countries, and therefore Russia would gain a lot of influence in those countries, which would have led to upsetting of the balance of power. However, the Russian proposal was rejected by other powers like Britain, which therefore helped to maintain balance of power in Europe. The system contributed to economic cooperation in Europe. The system, for example, allowed free navigation on the international waterways like the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, River Rhine and River Danube, among others. Navigation had been disorganized by the continental system of Napoleon I, and therefore this was a major achievement. The Congress system laid a foundation for other world international bodies in future. The success of the Congress system, for example, contributed to the formation of the League of Nations in 1920 after World War I, as well as the formation of the United Nations Organization in 1945 after World War II. All these organizations were intended to resolve international conflicts peacefully without European history. The Congress system, or the Concert of Europe, 1818-1830. The system failed to promote unity and international cooperation in Europe. This was so because the representatives had different views on some of the major issues. For example, at the Congress of Verona of 1822, the congressmen were divided over the issue of the Greek revolt, which was being supported by Britain, while Austria wanted the revolt to be crushed. At the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle of 1818, the powers also disagreed on the issue of slave trade, in which Britain wanted to take over full control over the suppression or abolition of slave trade, which was not accepted by other countries like Prussia and Russia. The Congress system ignored the forces of nationalism. This was so because it maintained foreign rule in some of the European countries. For example, it maintained Austrian control in the Italian and German states, and it also maintained the control of the Belgians by the Dutch. Consequently, there were nationalistic revolutions that challenged the Congress system between 1820 and 1830 and eventually led to its collapse by 1830. The Congress system ignored forces of liberalism. Unlike in France, where Louis Roman 18 was restored with a constitution which provided for freedom of expression, a parliament, freedom of worship and association, among other liberties, it was not the same case in some of the European countries. In the case of Naples and Spain, for example, their congressmen overthrew popular liberal constitutions that had been granted to people and restored unconstitutional governments of the Ferdinands. Consequently, there were liberal revolutions that challenged the Congress system between 1820 and 1830 and eventually led to its collapse by 1830. The Congress system undermined the interests of the small powers. The small states had majority of the people in Europe, but the major issues in Europe under the Congress system were always discussed and resolved by the five major powers of the Quintuple Alliance, i.e. Britain, France, Prussia, Austria and Russia. The Congress system maintained despotic monarchs or leaders in Europe who caused untold suffering to the people they governed. In Spain and Naples, for example, King Ferdinand Roman 7 and Ferdinand I respectively conducted arbitrary arrests, imprisonment, torture and killing of suspected opponents, and the Congress system always protected these unpopular monarchs from being overthrown. The Congress system contributed to unrest or instability in Europe. Many revolutions broke out in an attempt to overthrow the unpopular regimes which were being maintained by the Congress system. For example, in Spain, Naples and Belgium, countries like France, Russia and Austria were committed to crush the revolutionaries in those countries and maintain the legitimate rulers. The members failed to agree on the major revolutions which finally changed the work of the Vienna settlement, which they were to protect. For example, in 1821 a revolution broke out in Greece in which the Greeks revolted against the Turkish rule, and in 1832 with the support of some European countries like Britain, the Greeks were given full independence. In 1830, the Belgians staged a nationalistic revolution against the Dutch, and surprisingly Britain and France supported the Belgians, and in 1839 the Belgians got full independence. Therefore, these revolutions showed that some of the European countries supported and during the work of the Vienna settlement, while others did not support changing the work of the Vienna settlement, especially Austria and Russia. European history, the Congress system or the Concert of Europe, 1880-1813. Following his defeat in 1815, and he had died in 1821. The aggression by Napoleon I had been a unifying factor because it was a threat to the survival of the European monarchs, for example, in Britain, Russia, and Austria. The death of Napoleon I in 1821 therefore created conditions of lack of a factor to keep the European powers together, because thereafter what was a threat to Austria, like a revolution in Italy, was not seen as a treat to Britain, and the spirit of cooperation declined. The Congress system lacked resources, and therefore it was bound to collapse. The system, for example, did not have a secretariat to run its day-to-day business. It also lacked funds because the member countries did not contribute financial resources. This undermined the operation of the Congress system. The death of the founding members led to the collapse of the Congress system. For example, Lord Castlereagh of Britain died in August 1820 and was succeeded by George Canning. Tsar Alexander I of Russia also died in 1825 and was succeeded by Tsar Nicholas I. Those who succeeded lacked practical political experience in the European affairs, and they were not committed enough to see the survival of the system they did not labour to put in place. At the Congress of Verona of 1820, for example, there was disagreement between Britain and other members, as Britain opposed intervention in the affairs of other states while the others supported it, and as a result George Canning made this statement: "Things were getting to the wholesome state again, every nation for itself and God for all of us." This statement meant that there was no more international cooperation, as every nation was to be on its own. It lacked an international army to implement its resolutions. The armies of individual countries were used to crash revolutions between 1820 and 1830. The problem with this was that no single country would raise enough force to guard against successful revolutions in Europe. For example, when the revolution broke out in Belgium in 1830, Russia and Austria could not send their soldiers to Belgium because Russia had taken her soldiers to fight in Poland, while Austria had her forces fighting against the revolutionaries in the Italian and German states. There was mistrust among the member states, and this contributed to the collapse of the Congress system. At the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1818, for example, Tsar Alexander I of Russia proposed the creation of an international army to suppress the sea pirates or robbers on the Mediterranean Sea. The army was also to be used to protect their legitimate rulers against revolutions. This proposal was rejected by Britain and Austria, as they feared that Russia was to take advantage of stationing her forces in countries of Western Europe, which was to be followed by Russia gaining more influence. Therefore, Britain and Austria refused to cooperate with Russia, which widened the gap between Russia and the upper powers and led to the collapse of the Congress system by 1830. Britain's isolationist policy also contributed to the collapse of the Congress system. Britain, for example, refused to attend some of the congresses, for example that of Verona of 1822 and St. Petersburg of 1825, because she did not agree with the policy of intervening in the domestic affairs of other states to protect unpopular regimes. Britain also undermined the spirit of international cooperation by indirectly supporting the Spanish colonies in South America to get independence. For example, George Canning of Britain encouraged President James Monroe of USA to stop any attempt by Spain and her allies like Russia, France, and European history, the Congress system or the Concert of Europe, 1880-1830. The selfish interests of the congressmen and their countries also undermined the spirit of international cooperation, hence leading to the collapse of the Congress system. Britain, for example, did not want to commit her soldiers to die in foreign countries for the purpose of maintaining the Vienna settlement of 1815, yet in those countries Britain did not have economic interests. Another example is shown by the proposal to abolish slave trade. There was disagreement because Britain wanted to search the ships of other nations in case they carried slaves. The other nations refused that this was violation of their independence, while on the other hand they questioned as to why Britain, which had benefited from slave trade, was not giving them a chance to deal in the same trade. The outbreak of the Greek War of Independence in 1821 also led to the collapse of the system. The Congress of Verona was called in 1822 to discuss this revolution of the Greeks against Turkish rule. However, without consulting other members, Britain, France and Russia supported the Greek rebels, and this caused a conflict between Austria, Prussia and other countries, because the Russian intervention in the Greek affairs was an expansion of the Russian influence in Eastern Europe. The Greek Revolution therefore divided the Congress system and eventually led to its collapse by 1830. The Congress became very unpopular because it maintained unpopular regimes in Europe. In 1820s, for example, King Ferdinand Roman VII of Spain and Ferdinand I of Naples were threatened by revolutions. Under the Congress system, the revolutionaries were defeated and the despotic Ferdinands were restored to full control in Spain and Naples. The Congress system was also short-lived because of the ideological differences between the conservatives, no change, and the liberals. Britain, for example, believed in liberalism, i.e. constitutional governance and respect for human freedoms, like freedom of worship and press. Therefore, when the liberal revolutions were staged, for example, in Naples and Spain, Britain gave them support, yet the conservatives, like Austria and Russia, did not support changes brought about by the revolutions. It's not surprising, therefore, that Britain did not support the Protocol of Troppau of 1820, which supported fighting against all revolutions in Europe that threatened the survival of autocratic regimes. The system lacked clear guiding principles and therefore could not live for a long time as an organization. Besides lack of a secretariat, the system did not have a constitution, no work plan or program, and many times lacked a proper agenda. It was not very clear as to what was to be considered as a crisis to call a congress, and it was not stated clearly as to who was that congressman to call a meeting, and therefore the congressmen were crisis managers. The congress system ignored the small nations. The system was based on discussions and resolutions of the members of the Quintuple Alliance that consisted Austria, Russia, Britain, France and Prussia. Therefore, the smaller states refused to accept the resolutions of the congress system, and instead they worked for the downfall of the congress system. The Metternich system was very unpopular, and this led to the collapse of the congress system. This system was put in place by Prince Clemens Metternich, who was the Chancellor of the Austrian Empire up to 1848. It included an efficient spying network in those states where Austria had control, like the Italian and German states, reading of correspondences of mails, and the brutal suppression. European history, the Congress system, or the Concert of Europe, 1880–1830. This system therefore led to the outbreak of liberal revolutions to challenge it, and these revolutions divided up the members of the Congress system, leading to its collapse. The rise of nationalism in Europe contributed to the collapse of the system. The Congress system tried to maintain foreign rule among some European people, yet people wanted to get independence, which forced them to rise up demanding for independence. For example, the Greeks fought against Turkish rule in 1821. The Italians also fought against Austrian rule in 1830, and the Belgians fought against the Dutch, and all these nationalistic revolutions discredited the work of the Congress in an attempt to protect the Vienna settlement, because the revolting people were able to get independence. The Belgian Revolution of 1830 led to the collapse of the Congress system. The Belgians revolted against the Dutch, demanding for independence. This was to undo the work of the Vienna settlement of 1815, which the Congress system had an obligation to protect. However, Britain and France supported the Belgians, which was against the wishes of the conservatives like Austria and Russia. Britain called a Congress in London in 1839 where the Belgian independence and neutrality were. Therefore, the Belgian Revolution divided the member states of the Congress system, leading to its collapse. The rise of liberalism also led to the collapse of the Congress. The example of the success of the French Revolution of 1789 had demonstrated that the European people were disgusted with absolute rule, and they preferred constitutional governance, freedom of the press, association, parliamentary democracy, equality before the law, etc. However, the Congress system became very unpopular because it was protecting absolute rulers from being overthrown, for example in Spain, Naples and Austria. The lack of past experience by the Congress system led to its collapse. The Congress system was the first of its kind in the history of Europe to be established. It therefore lacked a foundation from where to draw examples. As a result, it operated on an experimental basis, which eventually led to its collapse by 1830. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 led to the collapse of the Congress system. In 1823, the President of USA, James Monroe, issued the famous Monroe Doctrine, which strongly warned the great powers of Europe against any attempt to intervene in South America to help Spain recover her colony. This doctrine was supported by Britain, which therefore widened the gap between Britain and the other Congress powers, thus leading to the collapse of the Congress system. Questions. Assess the achievements of the Congress system in Europe between 1818 and 1830. Approach. Definition of the Congress system, including the Congresses involved. Identify the objectives of the Congress system. Achievements and failures of the system should be given. European history, the Congress system or the Concert of Europe, 1818–1830. Definition of the Congress system. Aims of the Congress system. Reasons why the Congress system collapsed. Achievements of the Congress system must be given. A clear standpoint is needed.